Mukalla, Eastern Yemen. April 1995. A stateless motor yacht called the Sabah has been moving Soviet surplus weapons across the Gulf of Aden every dark of the moon. And her owner has not set foot on Yemeni soil in 14 months. He has no address. He has no port of registry. He has no photograph on file after 1991. But he has a habit, a single cove east of Ash Shihr he returns to every third night. 2 nautical miles offshore, on the seaward edge of a shallow shelf, stands a rusting Soviet exploration rig abandoned since the collapse of the People's Democratic Republic. It is the only elevated stable platform within rifle range of the anchor drop. This is Operation Reef Wall. Welcome to Agent Uncovered, where geography is the fingerprint no professional can wash off. Subscribe and stay close for patient, clean intelligence work. Mukalla, in the autumn of 1994, was a low crescent of coral stone houses along a working harbor. Whitewashed walls with teal window frames. The minaret of the Al-Rawda Mosque catching the last of the light. The war had ended in July with the fall of Aden away to the west, and the capital of Hadramaut was still adjusting to what unification actually meant when the money and the guns had all come down from the north. On the Corniche, the harbor master kept a paper log of every vessel over 10 meters that anchored in the roads or paid berth fees on his quays. He wrote in a bound book with a bakelite pen. He had used the same handwriting for 22 years. By the 3rd week of October, one entry on his list had stopped moving. A 26-meter motor yacht flagged Panama, named Sabah, owner listed as an Aden-based holding company that no longer existed under the new government. She had last paid harbor dues in Mukalla on the 14th of July, 1 week after the war ended. Since then, she had not tied up at his quays, had not taken bunker fuel from his tanks, and had not visited any Yemeni port whose harbor master still filed weekly returns to Sana'a. She was not lost. Fishermen coming in from Ash Shihr, 60 kilometers to the east, reported her offshore most weeks, running east and west along a coastline they had known all their lives, showing no lights above the deckline at night, working her tender only in the last of the twilight, when a boat becomes a shadow. She had, in the language of the trade, gone permanently to sea. Fishermen who had shared the coffee with her master years before, when the Sabah still took weekend cruises out to Aden, told the harbor master she was not the same boat now. Her rigging was clean. Her hull was clean. Her Panamanian flag was still on her taffrail. But her tender came ashore only in the last of the light, only at Al-Ghail-Bawazir, 60 kilometers to the east, and only for diesel and ice and the standard grocery run a working vessel needs to make once every 10 days. Her owner had not come ashore with the tender for as long as any of them could remember. In a coastal culture where a merchant's presence at market was the currency his reputation ran on, that absence was itself a piece of information. It moved from mouth to mouth along the Corniche, as such information does, and by the end of October, it had reached the ear of a man who quietly filed such things for a service across the water in Djibouti. By that same 3rd week of October, a station in a European city had opened a new file with her name on it, on the strength of an intercept. An Inmarsat call placed the previous month from the Sabah's onboard satellite terminal to a broker's office in Djibouti had crossed a listening station that read such calls as a matter of routine. The call was in Arabic, brief and businesslike, and it discussed the movement of 36 wooden crates of an ammunition type that had not been manufactured for a generation and could only have come from the depots of the former southern state. On the corner of the intercept, in blue pencil, someone had written the words, "scaling up." That was the moment the file crossed a desk in Tel Aviv and became a hunt. In Tel Aviv, The file was thin. A ship's name, an intercept. 2 paragraphs of context on a trade that mattered to a place that most of the world had stopped watching. Nothing that could be acted on. Nothing that would be for another 5 months. While a small team of analysts and case officers worked patiently against the negative space around the Sabah and turned the absence of a man on a shore into a picture of a man on a boat. The Sabah had shed her state, her flag, and her shore. What remained was a habit no one had yet found. The man who owned her had been born in Wadi Hadramaut in 1948. In the year the old sultanates still ran the valley, and the modern politics of Yemen were still 10 years off. His name in the family was Awadh Ba-Sharahil, and by 17 he had left the Wadi for Aden and a scholarship the new left-wing government would give him to a technical school in Odessa. He came back to independent South Yemen in 1969 with a Russian second language, an engineer's ticket, and a party card that carried him into a junior post in the Ministry of State Security. He was 22 years old. For 15 years, he was a small, careful officer in a service that ran on Soviet doctrine. And he was in that service in the January of 1986, the month President Ali Nasir Mohammed tried to have most of his Politburo shot in a single afternoon, and instead set off a short civil war in the streets of Aden that ended his presidency. Ba-Sharahil survived the way small officers survive an intra-party bloodletting. He was not in the country. A 3-month training posting to Warsaw had come through 2 weeks before, on the ordinary rotation, and when the shooting started, he was already on a train to Krakow, reading about it in a 2-day-old newspaper. He stayed abroad long enough for the survivors to sort out the office he had left. Then he came home to a new set of superiors who were not asking too many questions about who had been on whose side. The Soviet Union dissolved 4 years later. His posting to a joint hydrocarbons project on the Gulf of Aden coast, which had been quietly profitable for a decade, ended when the Russian half of it went home. He was 42 years old and out of the government business he had been trained for. But he was still a Hadrami on the coast where the trading families had been running goods to the Horn of Africa for 1,000 years. And he still knew where every Soviet-supplied crate of ammunition, small arm, mortar tube, and anti-tank rocket in the country was kept. In 1990, when unification came, he moved down into that older Hadrami trade. He kept a plain office over a chandlery on the Aden waterfront. He bought a house in Mukalla and married the second time. His 2 grown daughters from the first marriage kept flats in the city. His new career sat on the seam between 2 worlds. He was an officially clean private merchant on the northern-dominated books, with a licensed brokerage and an accountant. He was on the older Hadrami networks that ran east to Salalah and west to Djibouti and south to Berbera. A man who could put a serious quantity of Soviet-patterned small arms into a wooden hold in a night, at a price the market would pay. The 2 worlds did not overlap in any single ledger. He kept them apart the way a careful man keeps 2 currencies apart in 2 pockets. For 4 years, the arrangement worked. Then the war of 1994 rolled south and closed the office. The northern forces that took Aden on the 7th of July did not know what to do with a former Southern security man who was now a private merchant. And by the end of that month, he had put his wife on a plane to Cairo, moved his daughters to different flats under different names, and moved himself out to the yacht he had bought in Cyprus in 1990 and had never done more with than take on weekend trips to Aden. The yacht became his office and his address. He had brought the guns of the old state with him. He had a boat with a range of 2,500 nautical miles, and in Mossad terminal that would put him in touch with any broker on any coast at any hour of the day. A satellite navigation receiver that ran on the American constellation, and the personal knowledge of every southern warehouse that still held anything worth selling. He had gone to sea in the last week of July 1994 with what he needed to work, and by the end of that summer, he was already working. The people he had once served had scattered. The people he had once bought suits from had gone home to Cairo. He was, on a boat that did not touch land, still himself. The reason he mattered was on the other side of the water. The old central government in Mogadishu had gone under in January 1991, and by the middle of that decade, Somalia was a landscape of militias. The Somali National Alliance in the south, the Somali Salvation Democratic Front in the northeast, a rising Islamist faction called Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, working out of Luke and Ras Kamboni, and a dozen smaller warlords in between. The United Nations' Second Somalia Mission was pulling out of Mogadishu through the first 3 months of 1995. A slow, humiliated withdrawal in an atmosphere the outside world was already trying to forget. What the world had stopped watching, the men on the ground had not. Every one of those factions had a rifle roll to keep long, and every one of them had money. From clan diaspora, from ransoms, from the informal ports of a country with no coastguard. None of them had a domestic supply. Somalia had never manufactured a Kalashnikov. It had never machined a mortar barrel. Every weapon in the country came in over a border or a shore. The overland routes were closed or watched. Sudan was closed to anyone outside the Khartoum-hosted networks. That left the sea, the open water between the Gulf of Aden coast of Yemen and the Somali north. A crossing Sambuk captains had made in wooden hulls for generations and could still make in a night with a favorable wind. It was the last easy way in, and there was more material on the Yemeni side of it than any Somali militia could carry across in a decade. Ba-Sharahil sat in the middle of that geometry. He had two things almost nobody else in the trade had at once. He knew where the old southern states depots were and which junior officers on the new payroll would look the other way for a percentage. And he had a yacht at sea he could send from cove to cove up and down the Hadramaut coast, running rendezvous with the Sambuks that would take the crates across to Ras Kamboni or Puntland and drop them ashore, where a militia truck could pick them up in the last of the dark. He never touched the freight. He did not need to. The trade paid him in commission per crate, and he had already made and moved enough money that the yacht's satellite bill was a rounding error. He was, in the language of the trade, a broker. He did not touch the freight or the money or the risk of a bad night at sea. He did not need to. The commission structure of a middleman in a market of desperate buyers pays without a broker ever leaving his desk. His desk was the flying bridge of a 26-meter yacht that had cost him $500,000 United States dollars in 1990 and had already earned itself back 3 times over. His overhead was diesel, fresh water, and a satellite bill. His profit was measured in wooden cases of ammunition and mortars that would kill people he would never meet in a country he had never visited. On the far side of a strait, he could see from his flying bridge on any clear morning. By the winter of 1994, Israeli intelligence had begun to pay attention to Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya for reasons that had nothing to do with Somalia and everything to do with the movement of foreign fighters across the Bab el-Mandeb and the strait's role as a supply choke point for anything Israel or its allies might one day need to interdict. The men putting weapons into that traffic became names on a list, and the name at the top of the Yemeni end of it was the man on the yacht that had not touched shore since July. A man on a boat is not invisible. He is only inconvenient. At the research division in Tel Aviv, an analyst named Michal Ozeri opened the file on the Sabah in the last week of October 1994 and gave herself 6 months to build a pattern of life out of nothing but her wits and the small residues a careful man cannot help leaving. She was 34. She had come to the division from an academic post in maritime archaeology and had discovered that the discipline of reconstructing a wrecked ship's last voyage from a scattered piece of ballast and a stray amphora was the same discipline as reconstructing a live man's yacht from receipts and static. Her code name on the operation would be Curlew. It suited her. She was patient the way a shorebird is patient. The residues she gathered were the ones a yacht cannot help producing: diesel, fresh water, ice, provisions, engine lubricants, and fuel filters. A 26-meter motor yacht at sea burns diesel by the hundreds of liters an hour underway, keeps a fridge running around the clock, and needs to take on stores at least once every 10 days if she is not to eat only rice by the third week. She had to be visiting somebody's fuel dock somewhere, and the somebody was almost certainly on the coast she was patrolling. Ozeri did not fly to the coast. She sat at a desk in Tel Aviv and read paper. She read 4 months of receipts from a marine chandler in Mukalla, obtained by a route she did not have to write down. She read 2 months of grouper and hammer purchases from a fisherman's cooperative at Al-Gail Ba-Wazir, 60 kilometers east of Al-Mukalla, where the wooden sambuks landed the day's catch on a stone quay at dawn, and where the co-op wrote its sails in a ledger. She read the log of a Norwegian sailing couple who had crossed the Gulf of Aden westbound in November and had, being Norwegian, photographed every yacht they passed and marked it on a chart. She read Inmarsat traffic hits by antenna position, night by night, from a listening station on Cyprus. She read the standing weather logs of a Yemeni meteorological office on the coast and noted which nights were flat enough for a large yacht to swing quietly on her anchor, and which were not. By the second week of January 1995, the fragments had begun to snap together. A crate of engine filters was picked up in Al-Mukalla at 08 on a Tuesday. 3 nights later, 3 sambuks from a co-op at Bir Ali reported an unusual bright hull 2 miles off their fishing ground. The Norwegian couple's chart showed the Sabah off Ash Shihr on a specific evening in November, when the Gail Ba-Wazir fisherman's book showed a large order of ice and diesel taken by a launch answering the yacht's tender's description. And every third night, for as many nights as she could reconstruct going back to September, a small satellite call handshake had reached a specific patch of coast between the 2 ports. There was a cove there. It had no name on the Admiralty chart the division held. It sat between 2 low headlands, tucked out of the westerly evening wind, and its soft mud bottom offered a large yacht's anchor, the kind of hold no other patch of shelf between Al-Mukalla and Al-Mahra could offer for 40 kilometers in either direction. She named it, for her own filing, Kaur al-Mibraz. It was where Awadh Ba-Sharahil went to sleep every third night. He had shed his state, his name, and his shore. He had not shed the geography that held his boat. When Ozeri handed the pattern over to a case officer named Ehud Zaslavsky in a briefing room in the last week of February, the shape of the operational problem became visible in the same breath as the shape of the solution. The target was in Yemeni territorial waters, inside the 12 nautical mile limit, every third night for a window of roughly 9 hours from sunset to first light. He was on a boat that swung on her anchor through the night as the wind boxed round the compass, so his exact position within the 72-meter swing circle at any moment was a matter of chance and physics. He was on the water, at deck height, in a region where the warm sea rose into cooler evening air and produced a well-known effect. A persistent shimmer band, an inferior mirage, sitting in the first meter or 2 above the surface, boiling the horizon for anyone looking through it from close to sea level. And he was in a country whose airspace and coastal waters no Israeli aircraft or Navy vessel could enter without a diplomatic act. The elimination could not be done from Yemen. It could not be done from a boat, because a boat inside 12 miles was a Yemeni matter, and a shot from a boat is a shot through a meter of mirage. It could not be done from an aircraft, because there was no aircraft the operation could put over the coast without leaving a trace the size of a war. And it could not be done from the beach, because the beach was 3.5 kilometers from the anchor drop, and the beach was at sea level, which meant the shooter would be looking along the worst layer of the mirage on his line of sight. What the operation needed was elevation. Elevation is what lifts a shooter's line of sight above the shimmer band. From 40 meters up, looking down onto a target on the water, the sight line crosses the mirage layer once, at the target's end, as a compressed strip of shimmer rather than a spread of boil along the whole flight path. A rifle can be sighted through it. A tall building would do. A hillside would do. In the empty stretch of coast between Ash Shihr and Al-Mahra, there was neither. There was one other thing. Sitting on the seaward edge of the shelf, 2 nautical miles offshore, in the empty water east of Ash Shihr, was a 3-legged jack-up rig, painted red lead so long ago that its rust had gone deep. A drilling derrick still stood on it, uncorroded enough at the joints to bear a light load. Its crown block was 60 meters above sea level. Its monkey board, mid-derrick, was 35 meters. Its main deck was 18 meters. It had been left there in 1990 by a joint Soviet South Yemeni exploration company that had run out of contract and out of country in the same 6 months. Its ownership had died with the corporate structures on both sides. Zarubezhneft, the Soviet operator, still existed in Moscow and still had a Cyprus law firm on retainer for legacy assets. But the asset that mattered here belonged to a subsidiary that had wound up in 1992. Nobody was going to pay to remove it. Nobody was going to be aboard it. It sat on its legs in 28 meters of water and rusted. And every year the seabirds put another layer of guano on the crown block and moved on. Ozeri's map had turned it up the second she asked, quietly, for every derelict standing structure inside 12 kilometers of the anchorage. There was one. The rig belonged to nobody. The plan Zaslavsky wrote in the first week of March 1995 had 4 moving parts and 1 immovable one. The immovable one was the rig. The 4 moving parts were the mother vessel, the Insertion, the shooter, and the exit. The mother vessel needed to be a real, taxed, insured commercial hull with a real reason to be in the Gulf of Aden and a captain who could produce a manifest and answer a coastguard boarding party without hesitation. The operation reached, through a Cypriot broker used in earlier work, for a chartered coastal freighter of 140 tons operating out of Limassol under a Cyprus flag. Her captain was a retired officer of the Israeli Navy named Mir Livna in his 63rd year, who had held a commercial ticket for 8 years and knew the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden the way most men know a home city. On the operation, his code name was Halcyon. His cover on the water was a marine survey contract for a European geotechnical firm looking at silt deposition on the shelf east of Ash Shihr. The firm was real. The contract was real. Half his crew were his ordinary hands and did not know and would not know what any of it was for. The Insertion team went in on the freighter as marine surveyors. A Zodiac Hurricane rigid inflatable rode on davits amidships. A folding Klepper Arius kayak came aboard as personal gear. The team was 4: a case officer, a marksman, a spotter, and a coast operative who would run the RIB and command the exit. They flew separately to Larnaca, joined the freighter in Limassol in the second week of June under commercial names, and sailed south on the 18th. The Djibouti end of the operation ran through a scion named Naftali Ben-Ari, who kept a small marine chandlery and a stevedore business on the Boulevard Bonheur. Ben-Ari would never touch a weapon or a document that mattered. His job was to buy diesel in his own name once a fortnight on behalf of the freighter. to hold a shipping consignment addressed to Halcyon under an alias, and to know, without being told, that he was to notice nothing. He was an old hand. He noticed nothing. Compartmentalization was tight. The freighter's crew knew there was a survey job. They did not know there was a shot. The team knew there was a target. They did not know his real name until they had left Limassol. The station chief who authorized the operation knew everything. The people at any point above him knew a mission statement and a budget and could deny the rest. The equipment loaded aboard the freighter in Limassol had been sourced through 3 separate procurement chains that did not know about each other. The rifle came in a hard case from a Cyprus armory under a paper trail that named it as a contest weapon for a European long-range shooting association. The ammunition came from a match-grade lot bought under the same association's name a year earlier and stored in a Nicosia warehouse under a fictitious individual member. The optics, the rangefinder, and the meteorological instruments had come in over the winter through a legitimate purchase by an Israeli reservist unit and had passed through a Haifa customs record that would never be pulled unless somebody knew the exact case number to ask for. The rig belonged to nobody. That made the operation possible. It also meant that nobody who found the team on it would call anyone in advance. The freighter Halcyon reached her survey grid on the 24th of June and worked it for 3 days in the ordinary way, running a magnetometer and a side-scan sonar on a long tow behind her, painting the seabed onto paper rolls in her wheelhouse, filing daily position reports to a Cyprus office that never received them. On the 3rd day, she moved 15 nautical miles east, still working, and on the evening of the 27th, she cut her engines and lay to 23 nautical miles north-northeast of Platform Alif-Three in international water, running only her navigation lights and a low deck lamp aft. At 2200 hours local, in full darkness, the Zodiac Hurricane went into the water off the port quarter. She had a black hull and no lights. Her outboards were 2 Yamaha 4-stroke 200 horsepower units of the standard specialist type. Cormorant, in daylight Ori Frenkel, took the helm. In the boat were the marksman, Near Cone, call sign Osprey, the spotter, Tal Riemann, call sign Skua, and the case officer, Zaslavsky, call sign Petrel. 3 rifle cases were lashed down under the coxswain thwart. Ration packs and water for 36 hours filled a second locker. The Klepper Arius kayak, folded to 2 long duffels, ran along the deck. The plan called for a full night on the rig. There would be no second chance. If the target did not come to Khar al-Mibraz on this pass, the freighter would sail on her survey grid. The team would sit through the daylight hours in the accommodation module of the rig with the doors closed and the birds for company. And they would wait a second night, and a third if they had to, up to a hard-cut deadline the following morning. If none of those windows offered the shot, the operation would go home and start again in September. The passage in took an hour and 20 minutes. Frenkel ran the RIB at planing speed for the first 18 miles, throttled to displacement for the last 5, and cut the outboards a full nautical mile out and let the boat drift down the last of it under paddles. The night was moonless. The sea was 0.8 of a meter out of the west. A dry, warm wind carried a smell of drying salt and hot iron off the rig long before they saw the rig itself. When she came up out of the dark, she was a black shape against a barely lighter black. 3 legs, a hull box, a derrick rising like a stripped-down church tower. They came in on the leeward side, where the swell was down, and made fast to a corroded fender on the boat landing platform 3 meters above the water. The landing platform was a swing-arm structure that had rusted in place a decade ago. Its handrail was gone in 2 places. The vertical ladder from the platform up to the underside of the hull was still bolted at every rung. Cone went up first with a light pack. Ryman went up second. Zaslavsky went last. Frankel and the RIB stayed at the fender. Cormorant's job was here, at the water, and to be gone before first light. The main deck met them at 18 meters. The wind moved through the open steelwork with a sound between a whistle and a moan, and moved a broken navigation cable against a bulkhead in a rhythm that was almost a bell. Bird droppings 6 inches deep in some of the corners, a crown block far above them, and a canvas of stars beyond it, brighter offshore than any of them had seen ashore in months. The team took 10 minutes to move nothing and to listen. The rig did not answer. It never had. Zaslavsky held up a gloved hand and pointed at the caged ladder to the monkey board. They went up. The monkey board is a working platform on a drilling derrick, where a man once stood to rack the ends of drill pipe. It is a metal grating about 1.5 meters by 3 meters, wrapped by a light rail 35 meters above the drill floor, on Platform Alif-Three that placed it 53 meters above sea level. Its surface was corroded but sound. Its rail would take a rifle rest. It was the platform every part of the plan had been written to reach. They set up in the last of the true dark before nautical twilight, which on the Hadramaut coast at that latitude on that date was calculated at 0420 local. Cohn built the shooting position with the care that separates a marksman from a shooter. A tripod with a padded rest went against the rail on the seaward face. A ground pad went under it. The rifle came out of its case in 3 pieces, receiver, upper, barrel, and went together with a series of clicks the wind swallowed. The optic was a Leupold Mark IV fixed at 10 power with a mill reticle. A handheld Leica vector rangefinder came out of its case last of all. The rifle was a Barrett M82A1 in 50 BMG. Its length assembled was almost 1.5 meters. Its unloaded weight was 13.5 kilograms. It had a 10-round detachable magazine loaded that morning in Limassol with match-grade ammunition, and a second magazine to hand. The muzzle brake was standard. The suppressor, which had been discussed and rejected in the planning, had stayed in a case in the freighter. A suppressor takes the shock off a muzzle blast. It does nothing at all about the sonic crack of a supersonic 50 round in flight. And the 50 round is supersonic all the way to the target at any range this operation would ever ask. There is no such thing as a quiet .50 at this range. The trade had learned that in the 80s and stopped pretending otherwise. Riemann set up alongside his spotter, a Zeiss diascope on a low tripod, a wind meter of the analog vane type. The pocket kestrel was still a year away from release, a ruled pad in a plastic sleeve for the running calculations, a pencil, a pair of range flags of the kind sniper doctrine had taught for 100 years, run out along the monkey board rail at 2-meter intervals, so that the direction and speed of the wind on the platform could be read at a glance in the darker light of a torch shielded to a slit. Zaslavsky sat back on his heels behind them and did the one thing a mission commander does at this point in an operation, which is nothing. His job had ended when the rifle came out of its case. He would issue no orders now that were not the 2 words that mattered. The range-finding shot the plan had allowed for went off at 0112. Frankel had brought the RIB back around the shelf a mile to the east and tossed a weighted plastic drum into the water there and left it. Cohn ranged the drum at 1748 meters. He put 1 round into it that vanished into the black. He shot again 10 seconds later, corrected for a 5-knot westerly wind on the meter, and hit the drum in the 4th round. The muzzle report went out across the water and came back off the coast 20 seconds later as a soft, single, unmistakable double clap. The muzzle first, then the ricochet of the crack against the escarpment. The team waited in silence for 10 minutes. No light went on anywhere on shore. No radio broke. The rig belonged to nobody. Nobody had noticed that the nobody had gunfire. The two problems the plan had not anticipated were both on the platform itself, and both had to be solved before the target arrived. The first was the birds. Frigatebirds and boobies had been nesting on the derrick for years. 9 or 10 pairs had made the crown block their home, and another 20 were roosting along the corroded gantry rails. They had watched the team come up the caged ladder with heads cocked and had not moved. They would move if a rifle went off from among them, and they would move fast, and 100 wing beats out of a black derrick at 0100 is a signature no operation can afford. Cone and Ryman spent an hour after the drum shots watching the birds. The birds settled back to their roosts within 7 minutes of the third shot, which was slower than they wanted and faster than they had feared. It was manageable. Nothing on this operation would be more than that. The second was the flash. High on the crown block, 60 meters above the sea, a standard maritime navigation light of the disc lens kind still ran off a small residual solar unit whose photocell must have been of a quality nobody had allowed for when the rig was abandoned. It flashed once every 3.5 seconds. On, 1001. Off, 1001, 1002, 1003. The flash was white and short, half a second at most, and it lit the top of the derrick in a stroboscopic wink. No fisherman still crossed the shelf without noticing. It was the reason the local sambuk captains sometimes called the rig at Ash Shihr the eye that never closed. For the shooter, the flash was a spotlight 3 seconds long, once every 4. It fell on the derrick, not on the monkey board 30 meters below it, but it lit the underside of the crown block and threw a ghost of light down the derrick that touched the leading edge of the platform where Cone was set up. It also lit the seaward face of the derrick outward, so anyone on the water looking up in the flashing second would see structure, and anyone on the water looking up in the dark second would see nothing at all. The team could not put out the light. Cutting a solar unit at 60 meters in the dark, with a target due to arrive in 3 hours, was not a plan. It was a way to make a plan worse. What they could do was time the shot to the dark side of the cycle. 3.5 seconds is a long window for a trained marksman between the acquisition of a target through the reticle and the pull of the trigger. It is a short window for 2 people to agree that the target has been acquired and to signal the shooter, and shorter still for a rifle bullet to leave a barrel in the middle of it. But it is a window. Riemann ran the count in his head for 40 minutes, timing the flash against his own pulse. And when he found the count reliable, he ran it aloud to Cone in whispers. And Cone began to sight through the mirror world of a flashing rig and a dark rig, over and over, until the 2 versions became one, and he could ignore both. By 00:15 on the second night of the operational window, the position was set. The birds were settled. The flash cycle was mapped. The last thing left was the yacht. The Sabah came round the eastern headland of the cove at 22:17 local, running her navigation lights as a legitimate vessel would, showing red to port and green to starboard and white above them at her masthead. Her hull sat low in the water. Her superstructure was a 2-deck arrangement with a small flying bridge above it. And the flying bridge was where her engineer stood in the last of the light, one hand on the rail, one hand on a mug of coffee. She came into the cove on a compass heading that had not changed in weeks. 50 meters past the natural line of the 2 headlands, in 10 to 12 meters of water on a soft mud bottom, she cut her engines. The rattle of her chain running out came clearly across the shelf to the rig, 3.5 kilometers away, in the quiet of a windless minute. 60 meters of stud link chain went into the water. Her anchor took hold on the second attempt. She lay back on her chain, swung slowly through 15 degrees of arc, and settled, and the wake of her arrival died away against the low cliffs of the cove behind her. She was inside the rifle's range. The line of sight from Cohn's position on the monkey board of Platform Alif-Three to the deck of the Sabah at her anchor drop measured 1,820 meters. Ryman confirmed the range through the vector, with the mill reticle as a cross-check against the known length of the hull. 26 meters of hull, subtending 14 3/10 miles in the reticle, gave a range of 1,818 meters. The instrument gave 1,822. The two agreed enough. The number Cohn would work with was 1820. Cohn did the sums out loud in a whisper. Bullet time of flight at that range, from a Barrett M82A1 with match ammunition at a muzzle velocity of 854 meters per second, worked out to about 2.7 seconds. Bullet drop from 100 meters 22 meters. Wind hold at a 5-knot westerly on a 90-degree cross, 2.6 meters of drift. Add the effect of 35 meters of elevation on the line of sight, a small downward correction that shortened the ballistic path by a foreseeable fraction. Subtract the effect of a warm sea heating the last 20 meters of air. His hands were steady. His pulse was slow. The target came on deck the first time at 22:49. He was a heavy man in his late 40s, wearing a light-colored shirt and dark trousers. He was carrying nothing. He stood at the port rail near the stern, looked up at the sky for what looked like a long minute, and went below. Riemann marked him in the reticle. Cohn did not touch the trigger. The wind was still building through its evening shift. The hull was still rocking through a half-meter swell that would not settle for another 2 hours. The window was not here yet. Zaslavsky, behind them, watched a watch. The flash cycle on the crown block above them ran its unchanging rhythm. 3.5 seconds. On, off, on. He counted in his head anyway. Between the swings of the hull and the runs of the flash and the wind box round the compass, there was a window in this night. He would recognize it when it came. So would Cohn. Nobody would say a word. The night wore on the way an operational night wears on. It goes at 2 speeds at once. It goes slowly because every minute is a minute in which nothing must be done wrong. And it goes quickly because the mind cannot stay stretched at full attention that long without losing time in a blur. At 23:15 local, Cohn sat back from the rifle and let Ryman take the sight. The Barrett's monopod rested on the tripod. The scope was capped against sea spray that could not reach them at 53 meters up. Ryman watched the yacht through the diascope in 10-minute rotations, watched the flash cycle above them, watched the range flags on the rail. Cohn ran through a mental sequence he had rehearsed 100 times in Israel and had never before had to run for real. He worked his fingers, one at a time, then his shoulders, then the muscles of his jaw. He drank 2 swallows of water from a canteen. He did not think that he could later remember about the man on the yacht. What he did think about in a stretch of that hour between midnight and 1 o'clock, he would only ever discuss with one person, and then only once. He thought about a shoreline he had grown up looking at, from a fisherman's father's boat off the Carmel coast when he was 7 years old. He thought about the number of times he had been aboard boats since he had been in the service, and how the smell of diesel fuel on a warm night at sea had come to mean, for him, a specific state of readiness. He thought about the fact that the man on the boat 2 kilometers from him was, in every practical sense, in the same state of readiness. The readiness of a professional aboard a boat he had made a home. And he thought, briefly and without wanting to, That in another world the two of them might have shared a cigarette on a quay somewhere and had nothing to say to each other because there was nothing to say between two men who had chosen the sea as an office. Then he put the thought away. It was not useful. He was there to work. The wind laid down at 0040 local. The seas dropped from 0.8 of a meter to 0.4 in a quarter of an hour, as the evening thermal shift over the coast finished its arc and the water went from a low chop to a slow, even swell. The hull of the Sabah stopped rocking through its 4-second period and settled to a 2-second roll that was almost a heartbeat, a slow beat with a distinct pause at the vertical. Cone came back onto the rifle at 0140. Riemann read the flash cycle. The flash was on the down. He counted to 2003. The flash came again. Riemann whispered the count once, twice, then a third time. Cone nodded once. The target came back on deck at 0142. He was in the same shirt. He had a cigarette in his hand. He walked to the port rail near the stern, exactly where he had stood at 2249, and he leaned on the rail with his forearms on the top of it and lit the cigarette. His face turned briefly to the west. Then he turned back to the sea and looked out over the black water toward the shape of the abandoned rig 2 miles offshore. And if he saw the flash on the crown block above the shooter, he did not think about it, because the eye that never closed had been flashing there all his years on that coast. The hull rolled its slow, steady roll. Cone timed a full 3 cycles, and Ryman timed the flash. On the 5th cycle, the roll and the dark of the flash came together in the way they had promised they would. Raymond said one word, a soft, clipped hunter's call in Hebrew that did not need translating for anyone on that platform. The trigger brake was clean. The bullet left the muzzle at 854 meters per second and traveled for 2.7 seconds. On the yacht, 2.7 seconds later, Awadh Ba-Sharahil had already had time to draw one more mouthful of smoke and to breathe it out on his forearm. The impact came at 0148 local on the 28th of June, 1995. The round of a 50 BMG at that range still carries the striking energy the cartridge was designed to carry against light armor at closer distances. It arrived at a shallow downward angle, a little over 1 degree below the horizontal, the last kiss of the elevation the monkey board had provided. It struck him at the base of the neck as he leaned on the rail, and it did not need the poetry of any description. He fell without a sound anyone on any platform anywhere could have heard, because the sonic crack of the round reached the yacht half a second later than the round itself, and the muzzle report reached the yacht 2 full seconds after that, by which time the flying bridge above him was empty and the wake he had made in falling had already gone out of the deck. Cone kept the reticle on the rail. Riemann watched through the diascope. The engineer on the yacht, the Yugoslav diesel man Ozari had noted in her file, an older man in his 60s in the middle of a career at sea, came up onto the deck 17 seconds after the crack and stood and did not speak and did not immediately understand. His footsteps went aft and stopped. His voice, when it went out over the water on the still air, was a single word that carried 3.5 kilometers to the rig and no further. Then he went below at a run, and a moment later the yacht's masthead light came on hard and stayed on. And a moment after that, her Inmarsat terminal began the standard emergency handshake. There was nobody at the other end of the handshake who was going to come. Cone took his hand off the rifle. Riemann capped the diascope. Soslavsky, behind them, made a single hand gesture and the team began to break the position down. They took 8 minutes on the platform to leave it as they had found it. The rifle went back into its case in 3 pieces. The tripod folded. The ranging flags came off the rail and into a pocket. A single spent brass casing was picked up and dropped into a plastic bag. Two others that had bounced away in earlier range-finding shots had already been retrieved. Nothing was left. The birds on the crown block, who had lifted at the shot in a 100-wing shudder, had already begun to settle back. In 2 hours' time, when a dawn patrol from any coast at all might have come to look at the yacht in the cove, the crown block would look as it had looked for a decade. A rusted derrick with a light on top that flashed a soft warning at any passing ship, and a colony of tired seabirds who had grown used to it. The team came down the caged ladder in the order they had gone up, only in reverse. Frankel had the RIB at the fender. He had heard 3 shots in the night, an hour and a half apart, and he had not touched his outboards until the third came. Now he had them running before the team's boots were off the ladder. The RIB turned east, ran on paddles for 4 minutes to clear the sightline of the cove, and then the outboards came up on plane. The passage back to the Halcyon at her survey line, 23 miles out, took an hour and 11 minutes. Livna had the freighter's engines already turning over. She was underway east on her survey line before first light. Ba-Sharahil had shed his state, his name, and his shore. In the end, he had not shed the geography that held his boat, and the geography had turned into a rusted platform with a broken light on top of it, and put a bullet through the small space between his shoulder blades and the sky. The Yemeni coastguard patrol boat that came down the coast from Mukalla found the Sabah at 11:40 local the following morning. She was still swinging on her anchor, still showing her masthead light in daylight, her flying bridge empty, her Inmarsat terminal running an unanswered distress cycle. Her engineer had done what a man in his 60s on a boat with a dead employer does when the phone at the other end of the emergency call will not pick up. He had taken the yacht's tender and gone inshore in the last of the night to Al-Ghail Ba-Wazir, walked into the co-op ice house at first light, and told a man he had known for a year that his boss was dead in the stern of the boat, and he wanted to be off it before anyone else came to look at it. The Coast Guard found the body where the engineer had left it, on the deck at the port rail, with a wound the police report would describe carefully and inconclusively for a full week. The initial hypothesis was that the yacht had been fired on at sea and had run in wounded. The second hypothesis was that the wound was consistent with a fall onto a piece of hard fitting on the yacht itself. The third hypothesis, developed only when the Coast Guard finally allowed a small forensic team from Aden aboard, was that the round had come from a distance and had been fired from a position no Coast Guard patrol had ever thought of. By that time, the wound had had 4 days to age, and the yacht had had 4 days to be gone over by hands that were not looking for evidence. Nothing conclusive was ever established. The story that reached the diplomats in Sana'a in the first week of July was that a private yacht in the Gulf of Aden had lost her owner in an unclear incident. The story that reached the militias on the Somali north coast through the Sambuk captains who had been running the yacht's freight for 6 months was that a supplier they had trusted was gone, and the corridor would have to be rebuilt round somebody else. The corridor did rebuild round somebody else, in ways the outside world documented in general terms in the years that followed. The rifle roll into Somalia did not stop. It changed hands. Ba-Sharahil's 2 adult daughters read the news out of Mukalla in the first week of July and did not, according to the very small mention their names ever received in any file, ever come forward to claim a body a foreign government would not release. His widow in Cairo lit a candle in the small Coptic church near the Nile and said nothing about her second husband's business ever again in any conversation that made a record. The Sabah was towed to Mukalla by the Coast Guard. Held in the harbor on the Corniche for a year on paperwork the harbor master could not close, and then, quietly, sold at an executor's auction in Aden in 1996 to a coastal shipping firm that stripped her Inmarsat, painted out her name, and used her for the Eastern trade for another decade. Platform Alif-Three sat where it had always sat for another 3 years, its solar flash still winking on the crown block, its birds still nesting on the derrick, its rifle range still measured across the empty water to a cove that had gone back to being a piece of coast. In 1998, a Bahraini salvage company, working a decommissioning contract nobody had ever asked to see the paperwork for, cut the rig apart at its legs and sold it for scrap steel. The monkey board went into a smelter in Gujarat. The last brass casing on the platform had been picked up 3 years earlier by a Shayatet spotter who had walked back over the deck with a torch and a plastic bag. No service ever claimed the operation. No state ever named it. In the trade, it acquired a quiet reputation of a specific kind, spoken about only among people who already knew it, and never in a room a stranger could enter. And it entered the training curriculum of 2 intelligence services as the case study for the reading of a man's geography in a world where he had been careful about everything else. Which leaves the moral question. And the honest thing is to put both sides of it plainly and let each cancel the other in the mind of the listener. On the one side of it, Awadh Ba-Sharahil had moved, in the 6 months before the shot, an inventory of weapons across the Gulf of Aden that would kill over the years that followed. More human beings than any court would ever put a number to. He had made himself unreachable by every legal means. Every government with jurisdiction over any of the water he moved on was either the government that had inherited the depots he was emptying, or a government that could not act on the far side of a coastline it did not control, and neither one was going to intercept a yacht that had shed her shore. If the sovereign of that water would not act, and the arms flow would only accelerate, a state that measured the future in lives had one answer. On the other side of it, a man was killed in another country's sovereign waters by another country's marksman. From a rusted piece of industrial rubbish that belonged in law, if to anyone, to whichever court still had jurisdiction over the wound-up subsidiary of a defunct Soviet exploration company. Yemen was not consulted. His 2 daughters in Aden were not consulted. Every court that might ever have taken his case was denied it. A single-shot verdict delivered from a derelict at 0148 is not a court's verdict. It is a state's decision, dressed up as physics. Both of those things are true. Neither one moves the other. So here is the question. Was the shot from Platform Alif-Three a legitimate act of a state against an unreachable trafficker, or the same thing it stopped, done more neatly? Tell us in the comments and say where you are watching from. Subscribe if patient intelligence work is what you come here for. And send this on to the one person you know who reads maps for the pleasure of the empty water on them.